Thank you, and a big hello from London. A quite large group of weekly patterns this week, with one, possibly two interesting contradictions in there. To start with, in the currencies, we had a weekly reversal up last week in US dollar Colombian peso, which has seen a reactionary move back down this week, though we are still within last week's range. We also had a weekly key reversal up in the euro against the Swedish krona last week, and this also had a reactionary move back down, a relatively stronger move back down, though again still within last week's range. However, we had a really interesting weekly key reversal down last week in US dollar CNH, the offshore Chinese yuan, and this has seen a more than satisfactory move lower this week, breaking below the very recent shallow bear channel down to new lows not seen since May 2023. I cover this more fully in my daily FX video commentaries. We also had a weekly key reversal up last week in euro against sterling, and that has seen attempts higher, not always successfully, this week. The market there is capped by the relatively flatlining mauve medium moving average, currently at 87.25. Over now to stocks and stock indexes, and this is where we have the main interesting contradictory patterns developed over last week. We had a weekly key reversal up last week in UK FTSE futures, which admittedly has seen higher prices this week when compared to last week's close, though we are still within last week's range, a range that made a new all-time high last week. At the same time, we had a weekly key reversal down last week in the larger based and more domestically orientated UK FTSE 250 index. An interesting dichotomy there, especially as the 250 index has risen higher this week, working against that prior weekly pattern up to new highs not seen since January 2022. We'll see how these develop. We also had a weekly key reversal up last week in the French CAC40 futures last week, which have seen a small attempt higher this week. Over now to fixed income, and we had an interesting series of weekly key reversals up last week. In US T-note futures, in German Bund futures, and in the US bond futures. All three have had satisfactory follow-on moves higher this week. Now, onto the commodities, and perhaps the most interesting one here was the complete weekly key reversals up last week in the whole soybean complex. We had a weekly key reversal up in Chicago soybean futures, which has seen a follow-on higher this week, if still maintaining within last week's range. In Chicago soybean meal futures, which had a contrary and reactionary move lower this week, though not too far from last Friday's close. And in Chicago soybean oil futures, which saw a dramatic move higher, though through congestion between 56.34 to 57.64, and is now just short of reaching the first topside target of 58.10 for the very large, bright red September 25 to February 26 expanding wedge pattern. I cover all these three in greater depth in my weekly soybean complex video commentary. We also had a somewhat sympathetic move higher in Winnipeg canola futures this week, after the weekly key reversal up we saw there last week. This is also covered more fully in my weekly veg oils and oilseeds video commentaries. Now, additionally, we had a weekly key reversal up last week in Chicago corn futures, but this has not followed through higher this week, though we are still within last week's range right now. Finally, we had a weekly key reversal up last week in the Hermes index of the Egyptian stock market, and this has had an attempted move higher this week, though today this move up has been somewhat stifled. As always, I'm happy to answer any direct questions with anyone who's interested. And with that, I'll finish this section from London, and I hope that you found these comments useful. Thank you for watching and listening. This weekly broadcast gives the essential market patterns and consequences. Please be aware of the risk disclaimer posted both at the front and at the back of this broadcast. Copyright is Eddie Tofpick and ADM Investor Services International Limited. And here comes the final important bit.